This week's broadcast is going to be all about pastoral collegiality. We're going to try to organize this around four main points. We're going to talk about the whole idea of communities, both the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then we'll go to birth order. We'll talk about Laura, who comes to the pastor as an example for her second son to be baptized, and some of the issues that are going on there in that pastoral exchange. And then we'll end up with the book of Daniel. So let's start with the whole idea of communities. I think one of the things Dr. Swain wanted us to talk about were well-functioning communities and what characteristics we would come up with. I think that like a healthy interchange of everybody at the table is a sign of a healthy functioning community. Nobody's being particularly quiet. Nobody's particularly dominating.
Mm-hmm.
That was what occurred to me as a characteristic.
Yeah. I think also, well, just like this sense of like respect and like a bare minimum of listening skills, which allows people to be vulnerable and honest, right? Like, I think there's ways in which groups can masquerade honesty, which just turns out to be meanness, but like true honesty where there is enough safety because of established respect, where like then people can be vulnerable enough to be real and it can be processed. Like a healthy community can do that.
Yeah, I thought of it as in the healthy communities I've been a part of, everyone needs to have at least similar levels of investment. Everyone has to want to make it work as a community. Otherwise, somewhere it'll fall apart if some people in the group are not as invested. So I don't see it so much as everyone. Michael, you said not everyone's loud or quiet, but I think everyone at least has a voice. Maybe that's what I would say, that everyone has that same investment to make it work.
I've really been amazed by some of the seminary classes that I've taken in terms of the different personalities of them based on, I don't know whether that was a professor created it or whether it's just the mix of people that are around the table. But you'd think we'd all have the same kind of investment to try to be there and to be honest and creating safe spaces and things like that. And boy, there's some that get really, I don't know, very contentious and dominated by one or two or three voices that kind of insist on their, that they are right. And I know that's not really analogous to a community, but it kind of is. So.
Well, it's a community that, I think, I don't know your classes, but those happen when there isn't clear expectations of what's expected. And if someone ignores those expectations, then it's not going to be a true community. So yeah, I never expect the classes to be true community.
I'm always the idealist, the optimist.
Right. It'd be nice if they were. Yeah, certainly.
I think some people can be very like super sensitive or hypersensitive about their rights in community and insisting on, like, I don't know, that they're being infringed on when nobody intends that to be the case. And then you have to go back and do a whole lot of backfill in terms of relationships and things like that. So I think it's just, it's interesting in terms of well-functioning. I know it when I see it, kind of thing. And I know the class that's well-functioning versus the class that's, you have to walk on eggshells with everything you say.
Yep.
So let's go to the whole idea of communities in conflict. I liked the idea of those unconscious assumptions, but it made me stop and think a little bit about how each of them affect community. When the listing was dependency, and like particularly dependency on a leader, or that fight or flight syndrome that you feel necessary to fight your way in the group, or you just shut down. And then the pairings thing was kind of weird too, and interesting. Weird. What do you guys make of that stuff? Or didn't you?
So I'm trying to recall, this is part of the lecture, right? And we were, what again?
Yeah, when Dr. Swain was talking about communities in conflict, she said it often happens that we make some unconscious assumptions, and then she listed these three things as destructive to communities, I guess. Or
right, and so
we don't have to go there.
Oh, that's right. I've seen it in my notes. Right. So it's like
dependency on a leader, sort of thing,
right?
Or
and then how people are, when people are threatened, what they do, and
right.
And
the whole idea that there are subtle pairings that go on.
Right. And then I think she also asked us to like evaluate that in terms of our own experiences of conflict in groups. And I was remembering, so there was one situation years and years ago. I just had my first baby. So it was a really interesting time to be involved in such conflict. I'm like nursing through these like really contentious meetings. But in terms of like, I did see all of those things happening, right? Like there were situations where one person was used to have it. So the situation was there was a board for a group, and a new president came into the group and like decided to recruit some new members, of which I was one, because I don't know. I don't understand the backstory, and I think that's part of the problem. Was maybe they unilaterally decided this group needed a new direction or something. And some members didn't think that it did. So there was somebody in authority who was used to being deferred to, who didn't want to concede that. And then when the people connected to that, group were threatened, their response was to be aggressive, and definitely like pairing and splitting into factions and such like that was happening. And so I was like noticing those dynamics, and it wasn't resolved in a good way either. So it's a sad story.
It's interesting, that whole pairing thing, and how that can be destructive, particularly of a small group. If there are two people that somehow get identified in a certain way or linked in a certain way. As the intern in my field experience, we sit around every Tuesday at staff meeting for the entire ministry team. And I get linked to the deacon because, well, we're good friends and we're kind of I'm headed in that direction, sort of thing. But sometimes I get not accused of, but like I seem to be thought of as sharing her ideas when in fact I don't, and it's a weird little pairing thing that I never thought of before. So that was kind of cool. Anything else about groups in conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think I see all these things in different churches all the time. Some of this I'm in my field placement now with a pastor who's an interim, who's going to be there with me for 3 years. And we're coming in to a church, replacing two pastors who one had been there 12 years and one had been there over 20. So some of that dependence, we see that a lot. The pastor before us, one of them certainly pretty much took care of things herself. So that what happens then is that the next thing happens, right? Fight or flight. Well, you either, if you disagree with this dependence, it's either, all right, I'm going to fight or I'm out of here, right? I think that happened a lot. So it makes a lot of sense to me. The pastor and I were trying to discuss this again. It keeps coming up. So, but that makes a lot of sense for what happened in my context now.
Mm-hmm. Then there were some specific complications around race and gender that are, I think, also interesting in terms of group process. That whole idea that women are supposed to be nurturing and men are supposed to be competitive and blah, 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 and how that plays out in terms of a group setting. And I think it's interesting because I'm a lot of times in settings where women are in leadership roles. And I think women lead differently and much more effectively most times in groups than men.
Yeah, I think potentially that's true. though I hate to make generalizations of those kinds, but my experience bears it out. Though, yeah, it's not a thing you can always bank on by any means.
Sure.
I recall one time in my past where there was definitely an assumption made around how I would function in a group, which is so way back before when I was first beginning my religious education, my graduate. I have a degree in Master of Religious Studies before this, but it was in my own denomination or previous denomination, and at that, women are not ordained. Women in this academic capacity in the theological school were really new. I was one of the first to go through that. And so I wanted to do this particular class on a particular book of Swedenborg's writings called Divine Providence. And it just so happens that the ordination track professors were running that class when I wanted to take it. And I asked if I could join that class instead of having to do an independent study on my own. And the justification was for not letting me do it was that all those men, they get really aggressive when they discuss things. I don't think that, you would, be able to handle that, essentially.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And this from like a pastor who I adore and, family friend, baptized my children, and at the time I was young and realized probably pushing back wasn't going to work, but I knew it wasn't true. Like, I knew that I could run rings around any of them, but just to feel that assumption, it was, you can tell I'm telling you the story from, 15 years ago, because it really, really, it hurt me, to be, just to be so dismissed in that way.
Right.
Based on how someone thought that I would function in a group because of my gender.
Yeah. Anything else on complications based on, we didn't really talk about race at all, but are there any complications there that are worth talking about?
Well, just that I think that I'm just becoming more and more aware of like white privilege and how I may act into it without recognizing that, or, like how I'm just trying to be more sensitive to that is where I'm heading. I'm not, still learning on that front for sure.
Yeah. And I wonder how that plays out in terms of group process too. I mean, I think it's probably something that's really worth thinking about. I don't have any answers for it.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of smirked there because I don't know about either of your situations, but the Lutheran churches that I've been a part of have been not very diverse in terms of race. So with Shada, that it's an ongoing process to process white privilege, and how do you bring that awareness to your congregation? What I continue to hear from folks like the Decolonize group and others that are in my Facebook feed and in other places is that listening is the most important thing. So
yeah.
How do you listen and bring forth voices of people who don't look like you or are not from where you grew up to the forefront in a way that will help people to see that more voices talking about God and their experience can help to deepen our faith and our experience together. That's a mouthful, and it's easy for me to say, but I hear what our colleague Lenny Duncan is doing, and it's incredibly important. It's such a balancing act to figure out how to do that in our congregations without. And maybe the answer is just to make everyone mad for a minute, but how do you do it so that people can start to understand we need to broaden our horizons? But anyway, I think getting away from that in a little way, but that's our that's my context, is that in terms of race, people feel secure in their white privilege, and how do we disturb that a little bit to see God's family as bigger than just who's in our Lutheran church.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's really important. And how do you get those voices at leadership tables? I mean, I look at our congregation, which is at the cathedral, I would say maybe 35%, 40% African American, and there are 2 people that are sitting at a table of 12 that are of color, and that's not, even in a good place that intends to bring voices to the table, it's hard. So
I'd have to say 2 is better than none. I thought you were going to say there was, no, it's gradations, but yeah, you're right. More voices.
Right. And how to do with one last thing.
No,
is
sure.
this, I find it complicated by the intersectionality of it all,
Yes.
right? Like I found myself more than once to be in a class at Lutheran and found myself talked down to by a black older male,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just like, well, how do I make sure that I continue to check my privilege and listen, but do I call them on their own presumptuousness around, and it's just it's really tricky.
Yeah, keep your voice. Listen to. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
How do you listen and keep your voice at the same time? It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. I think we've already touched on this idea of examples of group process in our own faith communities or in communities of faith, like the vestry, like the altar guild. I think she made some references that were probably heavily Episcopalian, but obviously there are those kind of things in every organization. But I guess the real question is then, how do we prepare to coach those people? And you already kind of touched on it with the white privilege. How do we, as clergy, try to coach? How do we prepare for making better community?
That's such a good question. I feel like I have a much better handle on feeling like I know how to act in communities than I do how to coach communities that I'm not in, right? Like, I don't have a really good sense of how I would do that, or at least how I would do that abstractedly,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to hearing their context. I don't know. I think there are general rules, but context also means so much. So, yeah.
We had a really interesting last Saturday. It was the New Jersey Synod invited people to come to talk about LGBTQ youth and programs and all that sort of thing. So 100 people showed up. It was really, really great. I was privileged to be a part of it. And one of the things that they did was intentionally have a pastor stand up at the beginning and say, these are the ground rules for how we will conduct ourselves today. You may think it's silly that I'm saying this, but I want to get this out in, open in front of the conversation. The other way that occurs to me that might be useful, and I'm going to kind of get a reputation for this, I'm afraid, because I keep talking about it, but it's how do we bring Jesus into the picture? How do we bring the Bible into the picture? So maybe stories of the early church and Acts as a devotional before you begin the process all the time. Look at how something happened in a group, or look at how the disciples acted, or look at how the early church acted. Is that something we want to mirror? Is that something in some cases where we don't want to mirror it?
That's good. I think of a pastor who's a friend of mine who is not always good at it, but he's sometimes very good at identifying gifts, seeing in individuals what they don't always see in themselves, and saying, I'd really like you to do this, and not really, sometimes not giving as much of a choice as you'd like, but so he can be sort of, this is what you're doing, but in a group, identifying those leaders who can take care of the group, so that you don't have dependence on the pastor, which I think we all have seen in various ways. So identifying other people who can help to lead and foster conversation and move the group forward is, I think, really key and sometimes some people are better than others at identifying it, but it's really important to figure out how to identify those leaders.
Anything else about community, or maybe we should go on to birth order? You all right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to actually move upstairs, so I'm going to put myself on mute and mute my camera. If you guys want to start telling your stories about birth order, I'll join you again in just a couple of seconds, okay?
Okay.
So I think the question was, where are you in your family, and how do you see that influencing, your pastoral situation? So.
Mm-hmm. You want to go first, Michael, or shall I?
I can go.
Adam.
Sorry. So I'm the oldest of 4 children in my family. Traditionally, the oldest is seen as the achiever and the one who, wants to take over and lead and make their parents the most proud. And in some ways that's true for me, but I've never seen myself as an overachiever. I always done well, but I don't know. I'd certainly want to make my parents happy. I think, especially my father. I've mentioned before, my dad's a pastor. But part of it for me was pushing against that stereotype for a long time, including wanting to become a pastor. So I pushed against people saying, oh, well, you're the first, so you'll take care of it. Most of the time, I just want to go off and be by myself. I'm also pretty introverted. So I don't know. I think if I'm really honest, I see some of that within myself. And I think I've only recently started to really realize that my siblings look up to me in a way that I don't expect them to. My parents are getting older, and I've started to think that it may fall to me eventually to take care of them, even though all my siblings are much closer to them in geographic location than I am. So yeah, I don't know. I see it. I see the traditional sort of stuff in me, but in a different way than what is often seen as the first child.
Cool.
Yeah. The other there was something about how each sibling fills out a niche in their family, and my brother called me out on this on one of our family gatherings. We get together once or twice a year, and he said, "Oh, Adam, you're the funny one," and it's
sorry, I'm laughing.
Yeah, I'm funny in a way with my family that I'm not with most people, because I'm comfortable with them, and I know what will make them laugh. It takes a long time to figure that out about people. So that's one of the niches I fill in my family. But as I said, because I'm the oldest, and I think people are looking, my siblings are looking to me more than I thought they were, I may have to fill in some other parts of the family. What that means for ministry is trying to figure out what the niche is and that I can fill, but also always trying not to be the one who's going to take over. That's my impulse, as I think it is for many of us, to, well, I can just get this done and I know how to do it best. So as I said, try to bring people around you who can use their gifts to foster the community.
Shadow, where are you?
I'm also an oldest, and it's a little bit of a slight variation, though, in that I have a brother who is 11 years younger than me. So it's almost as if we're 2 only children, but not. So there's we share aspects of both of those things. So, and then I came to the United States when he was 7, and I lived here ever since then. So for my parents, it must have been sort of having 2 only children in a way. There's only 7 years overlap between us. I moved away to the other side of the world, and now his life, he continues to be close to them, back in Australia, and I'm here. So I have a lot of the normal oldest child characteristics. you know, like responsible and diligent and people pleasing and a lot of the only child kind of things, like maybe precocious or being comfortable in adult company, that kind of thing when I was younger. And then also, but also having a much younger sibling than there was, like it was a sibling dynamic, but it was like also a parenting dynamic in a way, which like really evolved over time. I think I shared a couple of weeks ago how there was a time where he really leaned on me. That was like from a world apart from each other, like on the phone when he was a teenager. So, and then now being able to grow into like more of a collegial sibling relationship, which has been also really great. I know for him though, that there's like, in terms of like where I fit in the family, I know he projects a lot of stuff onto me, like I'm the successful one and he's kind of the screw up. Like he projects that stuff, which I don't think I've ever put on him, or not consciously, I hope. Like I've always felt just really grateful that we continued in relationship. It didn't have to be that way given all of the physical constraints. So yeah, so it's got some aspects of both, and then that plays over into, you know, my leadership style, extremely responsible, you know, bordering on over functioning, and I'm sort of just realizing perhaps like resistant to collegiality in a not helpful way, like, or that like I really, really desire collegiality, probably in the same way that I really desire sibling relationship and why I fought for it. But a part of me still always feels that aloneness, and so sometimes doesn't reach out in ways that I should. So yeah.
I should make you do that. Ooh, why are we getting feedback?
Oh, bummer.
I should say yes about where I am.
I couldn't quite hear you. That's so strange. Can you say that again?
Okay, maybe if microphone.
Okay.
Up at the top.
Oh, right.
Does that work? I think it is. Okay. So I was saying maybe I should make you guess, because I don't think I'm a really typical only child, but I am an only child of older parents even. So I think that makes it more kind of interesting. You said only children, precocious and all that sort of thing. I think I'd spin that around in terms of that I valued sort of accomplishment, and my parents were intimately involved in my accomplishments all the way through. We formed a group, and I thought that was interesting. In some part of the reading, or some part maybe the lecture, we're talking about competing, how only children compete with parents as opposed to compete with other sibs, and that's kind of interesting too in terms of what I've done with my life and where I've gone. I think that the idea of being sufficient or self-sufficient that you mentioned, Chada, is really a part of my personality, and I think it's a challenge in terms of pastoral care, because I think I could say that it sounds really cold and calculating, but it's like, I don't think I get involved with many people's lives. When I'm trying to write these case studies and think about who I've served in some sort of caring capacity or pastoral care, I have as a teacher, but that's a whole different kind of dynamic than the kind of intense one-to-one, you know, these brief encounters of really helping people at some fundamental level. So I don't know, maybe that's my only child coming out. Any other thoughts on birth order and how it affects our ministry? Okay, you're both muted.
Yes, I don't have any further thoughts. I think I shared most.
it seems to me that we're both on. We're getting the feedback. I don't know. So let's kind of move on to Laura maybe, and she comes in and she wants their second son baptized and some of the issues that are there. How about the frame of reference to start before we look at the specific forms? What was Laura thinking? What was the pastor thinking?
You know, my head was really in the space of the cornfield reading when I was listening to this. I really was taken and interested in that whole solutions focused technique that she has. And so that's where my mind was going, right? Like as Laura, like as she presented herself, like, you know, first, as we talked about, assessing the level of crisis, right? Like, you know, to what extent do we, you know, her casual comment about harm, like, you know, make sure we evaluate that and get a sense of where we are. But if that feels, you know, manageable to keep going, then I thought, you know, to help her think about what she is doing that's already working, and then to think about, which the forms suggest, what does her network look like? Like those are sort of things that I was thinking about in terms of her case.
Yeah, I agree. It's sort of, yeah, how do you get someone to hear what they just said in a way that will help them? And yeah, I found also that recognizing any connections you already have and strengthening those, that ideal kind of question, if a miracle happened, how would things look? And how is that already happening? I found that really helpful to think about in terms of fostering discussion in pastoral care situations. So, yeah, and as a pastoral leader, those are the questions. As was evident in my role play last week, it's sometimes you're at a loss for words. So to have a direction, and I sort of sometimes go to a fault to avoid the fix-it mentality, because I know that that's not, people communicate differently, and if you offer solutions right away, you're shutting things down. And then if your solutions don't work, it's all on you, and no one's invested. Speaking of investment again, so to figure out some phrases and some end goals in mind when you're having a conversation, a difficult conversation with someone, it's really helpful to have that frame of reference.
And I think she's coming in with one question and then heading into another. I mean, it's like the whole idea of why was she there initially? And you see that in the book of Daniel. We don't have to go there right now, but you know, that it's this, the whole idea that she's asking questions and she's depending on a solution, and it's not the solution that she needs, or it's not the solution even that maybe she wants. So some interesting stuff, I think, going on there. Do you want to take a look at each of the forms in turn, or how do you want to handle that?
I mean, maybe just general comments, you know, instead of like one by one.
Okay. Okay.
Like like I love forms, so when I saw these, I was really excited. But for me, it feels really, really helpful to have a framework, right? And to have something that's just grounding, right? Like to ground the interaction, right? Like to at least out of the interaction, I need to make sure that I cover these bases and have this information so that it sets up a good foundation for continuing care. Like just to have that like present in form structure was just, it felt like a huge relief to me to just be able to be like, okay, there's a system, right? Like there's a system for accountability, you know, that accountability is not just like, sort of about ethical dilemma, right? Like, and how you act through that. But it's also about diligence and seeing through all aspects of care. So like just sort of bringing that all together felt good and useful to me. Like in terms of the form that had the diagram, you know, I'm a list person and I'm less like a diagram person. So when I first looked at it, I'm like, I don't know what this is. And then Dr. Swain walked us through it and it made more sense. Right. And I'm like, okay, I can kind of see, I probably wouldn't gravitate towards that kind of form because it's just not necessarily the way I process things, but I see where there was going with it and how it could be useful. So I reacted positively to all forms.
That's really cool. Sorry.
Okay, I'm gonna, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to see if anybody could help me a little bit with this form, because this was the most confusing of them all. And I'm glad you said that, Shada, because I thought it was just me. I'm going to try to make it bigger and see if that'll work. These axes are what got me confused. One says axis of transcendence and one says axis of immanence. And there's actually, I guess, 4 scores that end up going on here is like out each of the lines, but they don't seem to have anything to do with each other. Am I misreading that?
I didn't quite understand the score part of it, like the numbers, but what it was helpful for me to notice, okay, like just to double down the outside, like you're plotting somebody's state, right? And so you've got like, despair, and what's the middle one? Distress, and I can't see what the middle one is, but so essentially like getting a sense, okay, in this quadrant around their support system, like where are they? In this, like in terms of their sense of hope, where are they, right? In terms of, okay, their relationship with God, where are they? In terms of like their state of mind, essentially. Like, and I don't actually know how I then would go from there. Like I could potentially plot someone on there and then I don't know what I'd do with it necessarily. So, and I think that's just because it doesn't represent the way I think and process things. But I think that is how it's meant to be used. I don't know. Adam, what would you say?
Yeah, I'm with. Sorry. I just don't see it all fitting together as neatly as that diagram would suggest.
Yeah, I think it's intended just to sort of assess the level of concern that you need to have, need to deal with the person. It can also help them realize what support systems they do have. Looking at it again, on the one side, there's relationality for both relationship with God and others, and the other side is meaning with God and others. So if you're in the middle, then you're doing great. But the further you get from the center, the less you are centered, I guess. Maybe that's the visual kind of thing that it's trying to represent. So the numbers would just be a numerical way to say, if they're in this range, things are pretty much okay. Let's just talk a few more times. If things get further out, I would guess it's sort of like, we need to find you some more help, some more support, some more connection with God, with the church, or however you are going to express your soul, your spirit. I don't know if I love forms as much as Shada does, but it does have what I liked about any of these is that it can move a conversation from dependence on the pastor or the one offering care to a visual representation of the care one might need or the care one's already getting. And the other side of that is sometimes when you pull out a form, it's all about timing, just like humor or anything else. You have to be careful when you pull out a form because it can be super distancing. But it can be distancing in that good way too, to put your concerns and your negatives and positives in your situation onto paper, which is taking it literally off of you and onto something else. So yeah, it's a tool like anything else, but I think like Shada said, I'm happy to have them in my back pocket.
Yeah, amen to all.
Yeah, I really agree about the timing. That is so important. Like, I know I would definitely feel tempted to like focus on the form, which is why I think the best usage of it is to fill it out later, right? Like, and that's how I would, because I know that I don't have a very good memory for conversational detail. And so to have a practice of making sure that I have noted like some certain things for reference feels like, okay, I don't have to feel responsibility for retaining that and feel bad that I can't, yeah. So that's how it would be most helpful for me.
Did you get a sense? Something that you as a leader about yourself, or that you would fill it out together?
No, I got the sense that I would fill it out for myself. Like that it would be like a resource for planning their care, essentially. Was some of them collaborative? Maybe the last one was collaborative. Was that right? I can't remember.
I sort of think they could all collaboratively if you want to. But I agree. I agree with one anxiety that involves CPEs. The idea of how do you recall all that detail that goes on in the individual conversations. So, yeah, I think that they're interesting and probably useful, but not something to be slavishly devoted to. So. Anything else on the forms or on Sarah or Laura, sorry, in this situation there? Well, let's finish up then by talking a little bit about Daniel and his community of care. I tried to take a quick look at it again this morning just to see in this segment who was caring for Daniel and who wasn't. And of course, I think you got to start somewhere along the line with the bishop and her way of interacting with him, which I don't know if it's exactly the kind of supervision that we're talking about in this course. Any thoughts on the bishop?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know how it works in church, but it seems like that Daniel has a lot of supervision. Is it in the Lutheran church? There'd be like a senior pastor. Is it sort of the same sort of thing, like a senior pastor and an associate? I don't know, but yeah, her feedback seems to be. She's holding up kind of that mirror to Daniel to keep him accountable, and she's fairly critical, I guess, but also acknowledges in this last episode, you're back on your game. Like, I see you're back with it. I don't know. It's so complicated. All I can think about is her relationship with his father, which is. I mean, that's going to certainly complicate and mess up his ideas on authority in the church, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, that makes me think, I mean, in terms of like collegiality and network, I mean, they're separate things, but just noticing Daniel's father, right, who's then clearly not getting enough support around his own attempts at or experience of his wife's Alzheimer's, like to then be driven into like an inappropriate collegial relationship. Like, I just think that's interesting, right? Like, of those two things, right? What if he already had networks in place? What if he already had like good collegial relationships? Would he have done that? Like, maybe not, like, how is that enacting out or enacting through or processing, like he's doing his best, obviously, right? He's trying to process his own stuff around all of his loss and grief, but it's turning into this questionable relationship, which seems really real. So I don't mean it's questionable, but I mean like ethically. So it's just like, okay, how would that have played out differently if there were more substantial networks of support for him?
Yeah, I think. So, I don't have a whole lot more to say about that. If anybody else has anything that they want to get in, otherwise, I think we'll end our broadcast.
Okay, one more
All right. Yes.
Like I was like, I'm just interested in your views on. There does seem to be a lot of supervision, but it doesn't seem to be. It seems to be very. I don't know what the word is, like. It's not. It's ecclesiastical, if I guess is the sense I'm trying to say, and it's not. It's not psychological or formational, if you know what I mean, right? So like, so from last week when we talked about Robert and Susan, or, you know, like it's not that type of relationship where he's going and saying, this is happening and I need some advice about how to deal with it. And can you help me see like what, you know, like it's more like do your job kind of thing, you know, like, and obviously they kind of explore all of those things in the TV show, but I don't know. I just, I don't think I would like to be in that kind of supervisory relationship. I think it would really stress me out. What do you guys think?
I agree with you. There's a real tension in my mind with this word of supervision, because I don't see what we talked about last week as supervision. I see it more as collegial. I see it more as like a peer support, spiritual support, that sort of thing. I understand that that's the way the word is being used, but in this case, here's Daniel and his job. I mean, the bishop can literally make his job or break his job. So that doesn't support the kind of interaction that I think would be important. And really, I was talking to a priest friend of mine yesterday about this whole issue. And because we're so hierarchical in our church, there's nothing in place that would support people in the way that people need to be supported, except on an ad hoc basis, informally. The woman said there's somebody who knows a lot about canon laws and how the ethics of canon law work out. So if you have a question about something ethical, you might go to that person in our diocese to talk to them. But that, you know, that presumes a kind of ego or personality that is able to say, I need some help, or let's talk about this. And they're not the people probably that are having the problems. You know, I mean, I hate to be generalizing, but that seems to be what I'm doing all day today. So.
No, I think that's right. I think that there isn't that constant supervision in the Lutheran Church as well. There isn't. You gotta either seek it out, or something will come up as a problem through lay folks, right? And then it's probably a little late in the game to be seeking the kind of supervision you might need. So, yeah, it's a problem. And Dr. Swain mentioned, the kind of the Lone Ranger thing, and we see that all over the place in this area as well. There are some people who just don't take advantage of the opportunities for collegiality that are here, and sometimes aggressively so, right? And how do you? I mean, it's easy to ignore that, right, and say, well, okay, well, they're doing their own thing over there. I guess we'll just let them go. But how do you? We can continue to foster with those who are willing, but what does that say about the church at large for those who are off doing their own thing?
Right, and I think like we were talking about the forms as an excuse to raise some of these issues, a good system of peer supervision, I hate that word in this case, but peer accountability, if it were built into the structure of the church, it seems to me that would be an excuse to, it's not the answer for everything, but it would be a similar way to deal with things.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we have to do this peer. I mean, we had a situation in our school where for a couple of years we had to go watch another teacher teach.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, damn, we have to do this. Was there some learning that occurred as a result of that? I think so. I always liked it, but I couldn't say that I liked it because everybody else was grousing about it. So
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah. It's like, oh, well, that's great. I'll just see how they do it. But some people are like, no, they don't know what they're doing. I got it. Yeah.
we good to go? All right, thumbs up. I'm going to stop the broadcast, and then we can maybe talk a little bit about where we go from here.